hope I don't disappoint you. As you see, I'm wearing my love shoes today. What does that mean?
Love.
There we go. So, don't we all love this story? Isn't this just the greatest? The wise men come and they give the baby Jesus the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I mean, we all think it's just the greatest thing. And when we put up our mangers at Christmas, we love to put them in order. But what if we looked at this? I mean, it's a good, the wise men versus the bad Herod. But what if we looked at this a little bit different? What if we saw something a little bit different about the story? When the wise men were probably sitting at their homes, having a meal, individually, of course, probably, with their families, and thinking, I've got to follow this star. Can you imagine them telling their wives, I've got to go somewhere? And the wives are saying, oh, really, dear? Where are you going? And they say, I don't really know yet. And he said, what do you mean you don't know yet? Well, there's a star I have to follow. Really? A star? You're going to go out and follow a star? Well, how long will you be gone? Well, I don't really know that either. You can just imagine the wives' sort of suspiciousness about what in the world this was all about as their husband lost his mind. But what if we see it as they heard God's call? They sat there and heard that God was calling them to act. Wouldn't that sort of put the story in a different light? A call. We hear that term a lot. And I know that I used to think of it in terms of a call to ordination. Like Anne, like me, like Beth on her journey. And we usually think of it in terms of call to ordination to ministry. But in fact, isn't Jesus calling each one of us every day? Jesus is asking us to live our lives in love, to love God, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. There's really nothing else Jesus ever asked us to do. And the proof of the pudding in whether or not we hear God's call is whether we live our lives in that love. Whether it's helping an old person, getting closer and closer, across the street, or perhaps handing out a bag that we had handed out to the homeless on the street in this cold weather. And maybe it's not buying stock from a corporation that pollutes the water in Flint, Michigan. Maybe it's buying stock from a corporation that wants diversity and wants a world in which Jesus would approve of. So a call can be many, many, many different things. It doesn't have to be dramatic like the wise men. I mean, that was pretty dramatic. To leave their homes and go walking across the desert to follow a star, and they didn't know where they were going. I mean, that was big. That was big. Most of us don't do things that big. Most of us do the small things. And there's no question that when we do the small things, we'll do them each in our own unique way. It can be a big thing like the wise men, or a small thing like perhaps at loaves and fishes, stopping to talk to a homeless person or a person in need and giving them a smile or a hug or taking time to have a conversation. The important thing is not how big or small it is. The important thing is that we're connecting. We're showing love. We're connecting with others. We're not just living in our own little bubble. We're connecting. And in fact, when you really think about it, connecting is the only way that we can show love. I mean, yeah, we could write a note, say, but you're really connecting when you write a note. Connecting with a hug, a smile, a note, even minor efforts can have a huge effect that we don't even know of. I don't know if you all know the book, A Change in the World. This young boy at age 7, had to move from foster home to foster home. And the latest one was a foster home where he was chained in a doghouse sometimes, and then other times put in a basement. There was an unfinished basement, and he had to sit there. He wasn't allowed to eat. He could only eat the scraps off the plates of his foster family. He was forced to do all the chores. This is a true story. Forced to do all the chores that the family had done. And of course, when the social worker came, they were, oh, you know, Stevie and all this, right? But when they left, they were horrible to Steve, just terrible. And one day, Steve would be beaten if he talked to a neighbor or talked to anybody else. So he was sitting on a wall, reading a book one day, his only book, and a neighbor walked by. And she said, "Don't you live down the street from me?" And he was afraid to look up because if he did, his foster mother and father would see him and they would beat him. And he said, "Yes." She said, "Wasn't that the same book you read last week?" "Well, I just like to reread my books." A couple hours later, knock at the door. This neighbor showed up with a box of books. And of course, the foster mother said, "Oh, well, take them for Stevie." And the neighbor, quite insightfully, said, "No, I'm going to give it to him myself." So Steve came to the door and got this box. He didn't know what was in it. And the neighbor left. And the foster mother snarled at him and said, "Take those books downstairs. I don't ever want to see them again. If I see them, I'll throw them away." So he took them downstairs and he looked inside and there were books. And those books became his lifeline. Every 3 months she brought him more books. And he could see that there was a life outside his own. He could see that how people lived. And this is a true story. Today he is a college graduate. He has a family of his own. And his books gave him that lifeline. So you see, we don't even know the effects of what we do. We don't know what kind of change we're affecting in the world by a simple hug, a smile, a discussion, a book. And this is particularly interesting when you look at the question of addiction. The most recent research on addiction shows that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Connection. So what they found is, they used to think years ago that if you took a drug, immediately you'd become addicted. Well, we know that's not true, because if any of us have had a drink of alcohol and we didn't use it to our detriment after a while, we didn't become addicted. So something else led us to stop that addiction. And they know, of course, that from the research on having those drugs, it gives us a pleasurable response. The dopamine effect is released. The dopamine, and we've always thought, historically, that dopamine and that pleasurable effect is why we're taking the drugs. But if that's the case, then everyone who's ever had an operation and they're given medication for pain that's more pure than the heroin on the street, and they stop taking that medication, well, what's that all about? How come 90% of the people can stop taking the medication and only 10% of the people get addicted? So they started looking into it. And there was a Canadian researcher who looked at this problem and said, "We're going to do a research project now use rats." Now the reason they use rats is because rats are very similar to humans in their need for social interaction. So he put these rats in a little tiny cell, big enough for 2 bottles of water. Each rat was separate. And the rats had a choice of heroin-based water or regular water. And in the cell, the isolated rats preferentially chose the heroin-based water. So everyone assumed that's sort of what would happen if you had offered an opportunity to use heroin, you would naturally use it and become addicted. But then this Canadian researcher said, well, wait a minute. That's not really true to life. I mean, we don't take a drug in isolation within a little cell. So he developed another thing called rat park. And it put 20 rats in each rat park cage that was 200 feet big. It had mazes, it had wheels, it had other rats with males and females together. They were all interacting, and they had good food and just fun things to do. And they too were given the choice of heroin-based water or regular water. And guess which one they chose? Anyone know about this?
Regular water.
Regular water. Exactly. They thought, this is odd. And then, much to his surprise, he took the rats who had been isolated and put them in who had been isolated and addicted to heroin, and put them in the rat farm with all the mazes and hamster wheels and all of that. And guess what? After a few months, those rats no longer preferentially chose the heroin-based water. And the conclusion today of people who work in the addiction field is that because they made connections with other rats, whatever happened, those connections were more important to them than using something that would put them out of touch with other people. Now, of course, rats are routinely used because they're so similar to humans. They need stimulation just like we do. But humans, we add an extra layer to this. The studies show that children, very young children especially, need to develop trust at an early age. And if the children don't develop trust and confidence in their caregivers, they lead lives that are detrimental to them. They lead destructive lives. They lead hurtful lives. Because they never developed that trust bond. They had a separation from the people who raised them. And they found that the level of trust, or lack of trust, would determine the level of addiction later on in life. Securely attached people were much less likely to use drugs than people who never developed that attachment. Now, the good news is that people from bad backgrounds where they didn't develop trust and confidence in their caregivers can do that. They can do that through connection with other people, through therapy, through interaction. They can develop that trust. And with proper guidance and therapy, they can do that. And that's called earned security. So for people who can do that, the rate of addiction is way down. Way down. You see, a rat doesn't really need that earned trust. Rats can just be put in rat park and they stop using the heroin-based water. But for humans, they really need that level of trust and confidence. Now, AA and the addiction treatment community have been knowing this in a sense. They have the 12-step methods, and they know that when you pursue it and you develop the confidence and trust in the people around you, you can choose not to take that drug that made you addicted. Now, Portugal had an interesting research experiment with this. 10 years ago, or maybe more, 15 years ago, Portugal had been following the U.S. model of punishing people who use drugs. Just put them in jail. Well, that didn't do anything except increase addiction. And it was very expensive to put people in jail. But what Portugal did was a daring thing. They said, let's treat this as a human connection problem. They put addicts into therapy. They found jobs for them. They paid, for the first year, they paid the employer half the salary of the person the employer hired to give them a chance in the world. They had counseling. They were with that person every step of the way. And guess what? Portugal has now decreased its level of addiction by 50%. 50%. And that's because of the love and connections that were made. Love, connections. Doesn't that remind us of what Jesus is asking us to do? Once again, we find that Jesus was way ahead of his time, that he understood that the effect of love in the world can be life-changing. It can be life-changing with a little boy who's in foster care. It can be life-changing to someone who's addicted. Giving love and support and care to people is what Jesus wants us to do. Jesus must have read the research, huh? So the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, and it's connection. And developing healthy interpersonal relations is part of recovery. So when you talk to people or interact with people of anywhere you meet them along the way, you have no idea what a smile will do, what a handshake will do, what a hug will do. You don't know what kind of connections you're making. Big or little efforts, God isn't measuring. God is simply happy that we're out there loving and connecting. God is waiting for us to do that on a daily basis, and that makes God very happy that we are responding to God's call, that we are showing the world what it means to love. We are showing the world what it means to be a Christian.